My Lords Bishop, Reverend Fathers, Sisters, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name is John Ballard. I'm the Associate Vice-Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University here in Victoria, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our campus, the St Patrick's campus, for the 6th colloquium honouring Bishop Joe Green. In continuing ACU's commitment to reconciliation and in line with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tradition, it is customary to acknowledge country as we pass through. Today we acknowledge and pay our respects to the First Peoples, traditional custodians of the land and waters, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We thank them for their continued hospitality, and we acknowledge and celebrate the continuation of a living culture that has a unique role in this region. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Father Maurizio. I'm the Director of the Australian Catholic Migrant and Refugee Office, and it is my honor and pleasure tonight to open this night with a few remarks. Dearest guests, it is indeed a privilege and a great honor for me to welcome each and all to this 6th Bishop Joseph Gregg Colloquium on Ethics and Migration. I do so on behalf of the Australian Catholic University and of the Australian Catholic Migrant and Refugee Office of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Australia. This office exists to bring about, in a variety of ways, the pastoral concern of the Catholic Bishops of Australia for migrants and refugees. This colloquium takes place in the week leading to the 102nd World Day of Migrant and Refugee, observed in Australia on the last Sunday in August. And the theme chosen by Pope Francis for this year's message is Migrants and Refugees Challenge Us, the response of the Gospel of Mercy. Each year the colloquium, aware of the signs of the times, attempts to address an issue relevant to the treatment of migrants and refugees globally and in our local communities. The annual Bishop Joe Gregg Memorial Colloquium is in fact a joint effort of the Australian Catholic Migrant and Refugee Office and the Australian Catholic University. And the colloquium represents a formal platform for the Catholic Church to engage in dialogue with representatives from the civil society, religious leaders, and the private sector on migrant and refugee issues from an ethical perspective. In this year's message, Pope Francis insists that politics, economic choices, and financial strategies are the result of decisions that come from the heart of the person that always needs to be sensitized towards mercy, in the certainty that justice without mercy does not create true and lasting justice. It only enhances policies based on self-interest rather than on people's needs. So the colloquium attempts to explore exactly this, people's needs, and how the global community and the local communities respond to these needs. Whose responsibilities are they? what responsibilities? What is possible? To answer this question, perhaps, we may draw from Pope Francis' message delivered on the 50th anniversary of the foundation of the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, this 19th of March. Pope Francis writes, and I quote, "As the Christ on the road to Emmaus, the Church wishes to make herself close and companion on the road of every man and woman. Such a willingness to walk together is all the more necessary in our time, marked by deep and never before known interactions between different peoples and cultures. In this context, the Church will be ever more committed to the path of dialogue and to intensify cooperation, which is already fruitful with all those who, belonging to different religious traditions, sharing the desire to build a relationship of friendship and to take part in the numerous initiatives of dialogue." Close quotation. From the media and political leaders, both in Australia and globally, we have one side of the story. This is often represented in terms of war and conflict, and this becomes particularly relevant for the ongoing dialogue and relationship between Muslims and Christians. For some sisters and brothers, suffering, persecution, forced exile, endless wait in refugee camps or detention places, and even death have become part of their daily experience. In the heart of many people, there are fundamental questions. Is it enough to just be saddened by so many victims of conflicts and violence? Is the dialogue between and the cooperation between Muslim and Christian possible and effective, or is it merely an academic effort with no practical relevance? As for the first questions, I quote from Cardinal Turan, President of the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, his message for the month of Ramadan this past 10th of June 2016. Cardinal Turan said, "We cannot close our eyes to these realities or turn away from these sufferings. It is true that situations are often very complex and that their solution exceeds our capacities. It is vital, therefore, that all work together in assisting those in need. It is a source of great hope when we experience or hear of Muslims and Christians joining hands to help the needy. When we do join hands, we heed an important command in our respective religions and show forth God's mercy. Thus offerings are more credible witness individually and communally to our beliefs." End of quotation. As for the second question, Christian-Muslim dialogue exists. It has not been interrupted, and therefore it is relevant. It is important, and above all, it is possible, and it can bear the fruits of the Spirit. Of course, it exists and bears fruits in different ways. There are places where there is very little or no interest in this dialogue. Yet there are other places where relations with Muslim neighbors have become a normal concern for Christian communities. dialogue is always challenging, and we are not blind to the difficulties of dialogue. Our hope and expectations tonight is that with the insight of our distinguished guest, we may be guided into the understanding of Christian-Muslim relations in a persecuted region and the impact on immigration. I ask you to join me in welcoming Mr. Vaiaram Aktipe, President of the Islamic Council of Victoria. Thank you very much for being here tonight. He has been invited to talk about what life is like for a moderate Muslim in the Middle East, in particular, where war seems to be the order of the day. Please join me in welcoming His Excellency Bishop Robert Rabbat. Bishop Rabbat is the Eparch of the Catholic Melkite Eparchy in Australia, and he will be looking at the current situation in the Middle East. What is life like for Christians in Syria under intense pressure from the conflict there, and what is life like in countries such as Lebanon and Jordan, who've taken in so many refugees from Syria and Iraq. Again, join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Father Fabio Baggio. Father Baggio is Dean and Professor of the Scalabrini International Migration Institute within the Pontifical University Urbaniana in Rome, and is presenting on the European perspective of the migration crisis currently facing Europe as a result of the conflicts in the Middle East. The Scalabrini International Migration Institute and the Australian Catholic Migrant and Refugee Office co-host the English department of the online diploma on theology of migration. To moderate this evening, we have invited Fiona Basile. Please. To bring a woman touch in an otherwise all-male panel. Fiona is a freelance journalist based in Melbourne who regularly travels interstate and internationally for her writing and photography work. Last year she was in Rome during the Synod of the Family, providing coverage for the Catholic Women's League of Victoria and Wagga Wagga and the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference. More recently, Fiona was commissioned by international news agency, Catholic News Service in Rome, to capture, you might have seen this, to capture the story of Father Richard Shortall, Jesuit, who answered Pope Francis' call to be a missionary of mercy in remote parishes of the Maitland Newcastle diocese. Locally, you can see Fiona's work featured in Melbourne Catholic. She was a photojournalist for its predecessor, you might be familiar with the Kairos Catholic Journal, for 5 years. Fiona is currently working with the Missionary Sister Service to capture the history of this pioneering Australian order. Fiona will be our facilitator for this evening. We hope that after listening to our guest speaker, we may be able to engage in a dialogue of life and hope, in truth and sincere love for one another. As a concluding remark, I'd like to quote from the resolution number 3 of the final declaration of the annual meeting of the the Joining Committee for Dialogue, for the Pontifical Council for Inter-Religious Dialogue, and the Permanent Committee of Al-Azhar for Dialogue among the monotheistic religions. Quote, both Christians and Muslims consider peace a gift from God, and at the same time the fruit of human endeavor. No true and lasting peace can be achieved without justice and equalities among persons and communities. Religious leaders, especially Muslim and Christians, have the duty to promote a culture of peace, each within his respective community, especially through teaching and preaching. End of quote. This colloquium, therefore, wishes to offer the opportunity for an open dialogue on issues related to fundamental human rights, in particular religious freedom in all its aspects, for everybody, for every community, everywhere. The promotion of the protection of such fundamental human rights must be constantly evaluated with authenticity and actions. Indeed, people must not be persecuted and suffer, and must not be forced into exile for their faith. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Father Marvincio, for providing this opportunity to moderate this evening. Bishop Joe Grech has a very special place in my heart, as I'm sure he would for many people here. So the role of moderator this evening really is to be the timekeeper, to keep everybody on track, and also to help have a seamless evening. The topic for this evening is Christian-Muslim relations in a persecuted region and the impact on immigration, a very important topic to be discussing. The format of the evening will be that we'll have the three speakers present. I'll give a brief introduction to each speaker. Following the three presentations, we will have an opportunity for questions and answers. Each of the presentations will go for around 20 minutes, and then we'll have a further 20 minutes for the questions and answers. So you need to pay attention and think of your questions so that we have a really interactive and fruitful question and answer session. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker this evening, who is the Melkite Catholic in Australia, Bishop Rabbat. Bishop Rabbat was born in Beirut and studied at the De La Salle Brothers College. However, due to the disturbances in Lebanon in 1975, he actually had to move his school into a different high school. In 1979, Bishop Rabbat travelled to the United States, where he graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering and a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics. He worked in the chemical industry and management with several multinational companies and was responsible for operations in Europe, the Middle East and Africa. In 1989, Bishop Rabbat entered St. Paul's Institute for Theology and Philosophy in Lebanon as a seminarian for the Archdiocese of Beirut. He graduated in 1994 with a double licentiate in philosophy and theology. He was ordained to the priesthood in 1994 and in 1995 arrived in the United States, where he served at the Church of St. Michael the Archangel in Hammond, Indiana. He was nominated to the Board of Directors of Telelumiere International in 2003 in Lebanon, which is the paramount Christian television broadcaster in the Middle East. It is greatly committed to the promotion of harmonious relations between the various ethno-religious communities of the region, especially Christian and Muslim. His keen interest in matters of ecumenical led him to initiate an active relationship between the four Antiochian churches in the metro Chicago area. In 2010, the Holy Synod of the Melkite Church elected him to the episcopate. He was appointed Eparch of the Melkite Catholic Church in Australia and New Zealand in September 2011. And in October 2011, he was appointed as the third Melkite Catholic Eparch of Australia and New Zealand. He is currently based in Sydney. As mentioned, Bishop Rabbat will be speaking about the current situation in the Middle East, including what life is like for Christians in Syria under intense pressure from the conflict there, and also what life is like in countries such as Lebanon and Jordan, where many refugees from Syria and Iraq have been taken in. Please welcome Bishop Robert Rabbat.
My address by thanking our benevolent Lord for all his marvels, including tonight's gathering. The ACU, organizing committee and others for their hard work in putting tonight's colloquium together under the roof of ACU Melbourne, and for inviting me to be amongst a group of distinguished guests and speakers. And of course, I would like to thank you, the audience, for choosing, despite a long working day, to be present here tonight at this colloquium, in the hope of being enriched and challenged by what the speakers will share with you. In May 2009, on a visit to Jordan, His Holiness Pope Benedict XVI joined his Beatitude Patriarch Gregory III Lahan, the Antiochian Melkite Catholic Patriarch, for the Vespers prayers, the prayers in the sunset. His Beatitude welcomed His Holiness by saying, "Your Holiness, we welcome you to our church, the Melkite Catholic Antiochian Church, a church who is Catholic but not Roman, Eastern but not Orthodox, and rooted in the Arab world but not Muslim." I hope I did not confuse you by sharing the simple and wise definition offered by this Beatitude of who the Melkite Church is in a nutshell. Well, do not worry. Even His Holiness seemed puzzled a little bit when he heard the same words from the mouth of the patriarch. After all, how many times do you meet a Christian who introduces himself or herself by saying, "I'm a Catholic but not a Roman, Easterner but not an Orthodox, an Arab but not a Muslim"? If he or she does, now you know that they are Melkites. If I have chosen to open up my remarks with this event from Jordan, it was for two reasons. The first is that this event depicts an encounter of the diversity within the universal church, where East met West. In a Muslim nation, the Kingdom of Jordan, which will be a segment of my talk later on. The second reason is that I wanted to extend a personal invitation to you, the audience, in order that you shatter this notion of one size fits all. In case it had governed your thoughts and judgment, for sadly this is how the large majority of humans tends to analyze foreign and unknown events when they come knocking on its doors, such as the Zika virus, the MH370 enigma, and the sad events in Syria, Iraq, Ukraine, and so on. Many amongst you here tonight, myself included, upon hearing these words might smile saying, "We know better. We are well educated, and hence We know well how not to judge lightly the events we come to learn of, prior to collecting enough information. God bless you if you walk such a wise path in your life. But do you always embark on such a laudable exercise? Could you tell me what leads even the best veteran reporters, while reporting some of the conflict stories from Syria and Iraq, to use terms and expressions such as Kurdish and Shiite fighters are preparing for an all-assault on Fallujah in order to regain back the strong Sunni holdout from ISIS? Professional and objective reporting is about comparing apples with apples while offering the right information. So why do these veteran reporters, working for major media outlets, label one group of people by using their ethnicity? The Kurds, and being a Kurdish is not a religion, it's an ethnicity. And most Kurds are Sunni. Yet, as we said, they compare the Kurds to another group of religious denomination, labeling them as Shiite and Sunni. And most people who read the newspapers think the Shia are one denomination of Islam, the Sunni is another denomination, and the Kurds must be a third denomination. Reporters did not change that, and we accept it. Is there an agenda behind such a report? For example, describing the Iraqi or Syrian Kurds as a secular group, hence rendering them freedom fighters and thus friendlier to the West, while categorizing the rest of the population as a group of religious factions. Is this simple ignorance, this lack of knowledge, this temptation to choose once again to bundle everything under the banner of one size fits all? Regardless of the reasons, the depicted terms and labels color our eyes, and they influence our judgments and behavior in our life. Having brought back, I hope, to the table of discussion this important but often forgotten element from the equation, let us move on in order to look closer at the current state of a group of citizens, the Christians in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. I presume the organizer of tonight's colloquium decided to focus on these three nations which share geographical borders due to the impact of the major migration issue, or people movement as the United Nations like to call it nowadays, on their societies caused by the heartbreaking civil war in Syria since 2011. Please notice that I did not use the term minority group when referring to the Christians in the Near East. This is a sin, often committed not only by the average person in his or her daily discussion, but also by news reporters, a number of scholars, and in reports issued by multiple NOG and governmental agencies, when reference is being made to the Christians in the Near East or the Middle East. I understand that the word minority is an appealing and seductive marketing term to use nowadays in PR campaigns in order to grab people's attention, mainly the decision makers. After all, we all prefer to side with David against Goliath. And no one denies the fact that in comparison to the number of Muslims in the Arab world, around 400 million, the 15 to 20 million Christian citizens of the Near East are truly small. However, please bear in mind that the Christian communities in the Near East predate Islam. And when people keep on using this minority term over and over again, they tend unknowingly, as time goes by, to reinforce this notion of second-class citizen notion, the notion of the dhimmi people, as Christians were sadly labeled and treated as such for hundreds of years by the Muslim rulers who governed the area, especially with the establishment of the Ottoman Empire. Let us refocus now back our attention to Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, though these three nations are Arab nations. Geographically close and located in the Near East, we need to keep in mind that the status of the Christian in these lands depends very much on the nation state considered and which particular form of Islam is known. Let's begin by Syria. Prior to 2011, Syria had a population of 23 million people, 9% or 10% of whom were Christians. 5 years later, sadly, the current population of Syria has dwindled to 16 million, as 7 million Syrians have become refugees. The bulk of these refugees are currently in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. And the current number of Christians in Syria has gone down now to around 5%. Lebanon is a nation of only 4 million people. Lebanon and Syria share the same borders. Christians living currently in Lebanon represent 30 to 40% of the total population. Since the war in Syria, 2 million displaced people entered Lebanon. Imagine if you live in a nation of 4 million people and then overnight 2 million people enter your country. We're having a big problem in Australia to welcome 12,000 people. Jordan is a kingdom of 8 million people. Syrians make 12 million, Iraqi 1 million, Palestinians in camp sadly 1 million. They do have Palestinians who have dual citizenship, 2 million, and the Jordans are 2 million. Native Jordanians. Christians in Jordan are 8%. So here we have three nations. Syria and Lebanon do share the same border. Syria is between Jordan and Lebanon. Three different nations in the Near East. For most people will say they are in the Arab world and they are Muslims. Well, Jordan, as we said, is a kingdom where the majority are Sunni, where some of you might know it and others might not know it. But the king is related to the family of the Prophet. They go all the way in a lineage. Hence, Saudi Arabia feels always obligated to keep the king in power. But this is a nation where you have a king which is tightly under the grip of the king and his government. Christians there have lived for many years. But when we think of Jordan, we forget that the Jordan River exists there, and that Christianity was there, and still is there. But as we said, it's a minority now, quote unquote, if you like to use the word minority, of 8%. Now, who are the Christians there? You have Roman Catholics, you have Melkite Catholics, you do have Orthodox, are not Ethiopian, they are from Jerusalem. So you have also a diversity of Christians. But most of these Christians are entrepreneurs. Why? Because due to a historical trend, people who came and governed us, and they were Muslims, for whatever reason did not trust us. And hence, when you don't trust someone, you don't invite them into your home. Hence, Christians were not invited to be part of the governments, to be part of the army. They only were able to be entrepreneurs and farmers. And that's what you still discover. Some of the best entrepreneurs, business people, thinkers are Christians. They were given these opportunities. However, they were not given the opportunity to be able to be among the decision makers, even till now. Because the Constitution of Jordan and the Constitution of Syria are based on the Quran. Hence, the leader has to be a Muslim. But while, as we said, in Jordan the leader is a Sunni, a king, in Syria it's governed by the rule of one party, the Ba'ath Party. But those who are in power are from the Alawi, an offshoot of the Shia. They are a minority. Again, we have to use the term, a minority, relatively saying, because they represent around 30 to 40% of the population. And one thing which is very interesting, that very few people know of, is that the person who wrote all the statutes of the Ba'ath Party was a Christian, who sadly after a while had to go to Iraq. He had to run away. And when he went to Iraq, what did he do? He also wrote the statutes of the Ba'ath Party of Iraq, with only one simple difference. When he was in Syria, he said Syria should have the upper hand in the Arab world. When he went to Iraq, he said it should be right. But he was a Christian. How interesting it is. Because what happened in the Middle East, you have to keep in mind, is that with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, after World War I, people said, we might have a chance that we can bypass maybe a religion. We can still have the respect for our own religion, but we might bypass it and create a system where Muslims and Christians and other groups, like the Yazidi and so on and so forth, can live together. As there were attempts. Unfortunately, they did not survive for the Nasser tried some in Egypt, as I said, in Syria. If you really look into the Ba'ath Party, you can see that it's a secular. But at the end of the day, especially now with what's going on in Syria, it has shifted slowly but surely towards becoming a dominant Muslim, Shia denomination. If we move into Lebanon, Lebanon is a nation where Christians had the upper hand. Prior to 1975, in 1975 there was a war, a civil war in Lebanon, and Christians started by migrating, and now, as I mentioned to you, the numbers went down to around 30 to 40%. The Constitution of Lebanon is a dream that we are still hoping that it will become a reality. It's a dream where Christians and Muslims there can come together and have a dialogue. The president of Lebanon is a Christian, the prime minister is a Sunni, the president of the House of the Parliament is a Shia. It's the only nation on earth where the Feast of the Annunciation of the Virgin Mary is a national holiday, where Muslims and Christians come into one place and both of them show reverence to the Virgin Mary. It's a place, as I said, where there is an ongoing dialogue. So here are three nations in the Arab world. They share borders. They speak the same language, on the average, Arabic. Yet, if a Christian would move from Jordan into Syria, into Lebanon, he or she will see a difference. They can pray in Jordan. They can pray in Syria. However, they know there are kind of a ceiling where they can go high. In Lebanon, it's different. In Lebanon, you can build a church without asking your government to give you a permit. Just a building permit. In Jordan and in Syria, you have to think twice. It doesn't mean you don't get it, but it's a challenge because you have the neighborhood, and the neighborhood is a majority of Muslim people. Now, sadly, what happened in Syria, as I said 5 years ago, did create this big movement of population. And like everything else in the world, what happens when war takes place, people have tendency to move within their country and across. So they moved into Lebanon and Jordan. Now it depends, of course, like in any war, where do you live? If you're living under ISIS, most Christians have left this area. Because ISIS, sadly, for their own belief from day one said, either you look like us or leave us when we kill you. We don't want diversity. We have the truth and we know better. There might be still some Christians, I'm not saying they are moving around in the way killing everybody. They might have left a few small people there, minorities, all those things. The rest have moved to more safer area, either within Christian enclaves or some of the major cities. They still live in Damascus and other places, or they moved into Lebanon and Syria, in Jordan. Mainly they moved into Lebanon because from Lebanon either they had relatives or they were welcomed by churches, but in reality they are looking to come to Australia or to America or to Are they persecuted only because they are Christians? I don't think so. Sunni have paid a price, like other people. Shiite have paid a price, and vice versa. The war in Syria is not really against the Christians, but the Christian will pay a price for, sadly, this idea. I don't know from where this idea came into the Arab world. Most Muslims in the Arab world think that the Christians are left over from the Crusades. And hence, sometimes when they get upset with America, when they get upset with France, with Australia, with the Western world, so what do? Let's beat on one of these Christians, because they are left over from the Crusades. It's a prevailing thought. It doesn't mean the educated Muslims do not know reality, and a good number of Muslims do not know reality. But for whatever reason, this is the way they think. So there are times where we pay a price. I personally believe the Christians are paying a big price, because when you hear the news, you only hear about the Sunni, the Shiite, and the Kurd, as if the Christians do not live there or belong to that area. This is why I started my talk by mentioning this one size fits all. So we think it's the Arab world? You have to be in Muslim. Whenever I have a discussion with people and I tell them I come from the Middle East, they say, oh, you come from Israel? I said, no. And they said, you're a Muslim? I said, no. I'm a Christian. They said, when did you convert? Most people have forgotten that Christianity started in the Middle East. Well, allow me to conclude my words with a few thoughts. More so than any other time in history, war and its consequences touch every member of our society in an immediate and compelling way. The earliest conflict for which there is a comprehensive photographic record is the American Civil War. Prior to this, the horrors of warfare were sanitized on the canvases of the great court painters of whatever era. Today, however, camera crews and war reporters, embedded with battlefield troops, bring the tragedy of warfare into our homes at each newscast. Hence, this war could reach us, knowingly or unknowingly. We can no longer say it's somewhere far. And I'm sure many of you have heard and read the famous saying of George Santayana: those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat. The present crisis is before us, and it is for us to do something about it. As St. John Chrysostom noted, everything is God's except the good deeds of humankind. It is the only thing that we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Rabbat. As we might just take 30 seconds just to let those last words sink in. Our next speaker this evening is Mr. Bayram Aktepe. Mr. Bayram Aktepe has been President of the Islamic Council of Victoria since September 2015. Prior to that, he served a number of terms in the 1990s and 2000s on the board, including as Secretary and in 2014 as Vice President. Mr. Aktepe is a professional aerospace engineer and currently runs a successful consulting firm for project management services in high-tech industries. Previously, he worked in the Federal Department of Defence and in state government in corrections, where he ran social development programs and monitored prison infrastructure programs. From 2005 to 2011, he spent time abroad in Qatar, where he led the planning of the 2006 Asian Games. He provided strategic programming advice to the Qatar Olympic Committee and the massive long-term Qatar National Vision 2030 project. Mr. Aktepe has been a pioneering leader and member of many notable projects within the Muslim community since 1990, including the establishment of RMIT's first mosque, starting up the Ilm College, starting the Islamic Council of Victoria Prison Chaplaincy Program, and the Ottoman Military Band, among others. He has also served on the Refugee Action Group and at Melbourne Ethnic Radio 3ZZZ. This evening, he will speak about what life is like for a moderate Muslim in the Middle East, in particular where war seems to be the order of the day. Please welcome Mr. Bayram Aktepe.
In the name of God, most beneficent, most graceful, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and paying my respects to their elders past and present. Dr. John Ballard, Associate Vice Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University, Father Maurizio Patena, Director of the ACMRO, Bishop Robert Rabbat, and Father Fabio Baggio. Tonight, as a lay person among so many scholars and people of faith, I feel that I feel like a relatively simple person. Now, as a person of faith and as a leader within the Muslim community, and I think the term moderate was used, hopefully I'll describe a Muslim perspective on what's happening in the Middle East at the moment. In terms of my background, let me say that I'm of Turkish background. So we left Turkey when I was 5 years old. I've spent virtually the bulk of my whole life here in Australia, but have frequented Turkey numerous times. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is probably from a peacetime perspective in a Muslim country, in Qatar, for about 6 years. And what shapes the Middle Eastern psyche, whether it be Muslim, Christian, or any other group that have migrated there. And I'll talk a little bit about the differences that exist in the Muslim world, because no two countries are the same. And in fact, they're all very different in their political and their religious outlooks. And I'll shed some light on some of that. When I was in Qatar, it was quite funny that being a Muslim from Australia of Turkish background, people didn't know what to refer to me as, so they referred to me as an Australian of Turkish origin, and I just happened to be a Muslim sort of thing. So it was quite funny, but among my closest friends were an Orthodox Christian Arab American, for example. I had an Indian housemate who happened to be not Hindu but Catholic. I had a Filipino housemate who wasn't Catholic but rather Buddhist. And then finally I had a Filipino housemate who wasn't Catholic and a practicing Catholic. And I think one of the most memorable experiences that I had in Qatar was she was a battered woman when we picked her up from a manpower agency. She spent time with a family who had ill-treated her. She had issues with her husband in the Philippines. And she had enormous bruising on her knuckles. And we picked her up and we gave her a home. We clothed her. And she started going to church. And this was an enormous thing. And she kept going to church, and every Saturday she went to church. And then when we were leaving Qatar, we handed her over to a Swiss family who we kept in touch with, and we still see her every time we go back to Qatar. I wasn't intending to tell that story, by the way. But anyway, I guess the Middle East presents a melting pot. And it's not what we think it is, in the sense that it's not just Muslims that live in the Middle East. It's not just Christians that live in the Middle East. There's a whole melting pot. And if we look at the history of humanity, it's a story of migration. I'd like to think that most of us in this room believe in Adam and Eve, and we all believe that they started somewhere in the Middle East. And that somehow humanity got to South America, it got to China, it got to Western Europe. And so what we see today may not be a reflection of what we're going to see in 1,000 years, or not what we personally will see, but what our grandchildren will see in 1,000 years. What will the shape of the world look like in terms of where people are and what they look like and what faith they have is something that we can shape today. And that shaping can come about by us all accepting one another, I would like to think. So that migration experience and what we're seeing today is actually a shift in embracing one another to being more extremist in many ways, or polarisation of countries. And I think we're even seeing a large part of that being played right now here in Australia with the polarisation of communities. Let me say that in terms of the religious models that exist in the Middle East, because I think the religious models shape some of what's going on in terms of the wars. I view it as there are, in terms of the Muslim landscape, there's the producer countries and there's the consumer countries. And what I mean by that is that there are those who directly influence what Islam looks like. They're the producer countries. And there's 4 of them in my thinking. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, and Egypt. And why do I say that? Historically, the Caliphate during the Ottoman Empire was in Istanbul, and so there's still a strong emphasis on Islam in Turkey. Over 90% of Turks still identify as Muslim, and they have a specific strand or a specific understanding of Islam that's carried through the generations. Saudi Arabia is a recent newcomer to the scene in terms of the last 200 years, or perhaps even 150, one might say, with the advent of Wahhabism and what that's led to. So there's their model that they're exporting to consumer Muslim countries by and large. The Iranian model is the Shia model, and so the stamp that they're trying to put on their neighbours is very pronounced at the same time. And then Egypt has been a bedrock of Islamic understanding, and it's had the Caliphate, and so there's a history there as well. But it's somewhat different to the Turkish model that has some similarities. Now, if you consider those and the sort of influence that each of these 4 countries is trying to exert on their neighbours, you get the likes of Syria and Iraq caught right in the middle of it, geographically. And that's what we're seeing. The likes of Jordan and Lebanon reflect the fact that there are those diversities. And then you've got the layer of race in between it all as well. So, if if we look at those countries as being the producers, where are the consumers? The consumers are countries as close as India. When we think of India and what sort of Islam is practiced in India, one questions, where does it come from? And it probably is closest to the Turkish influence. The Balkans have the Turkish influence. The East Asians have a very different influence yet again. So there's that aspect of it all. And when we look at a nation like Qatar in the Middle East, and all of these are different in terms of what they actually implement, what that religious ideology, how it manifests itself in life, is in various forms. The first of those is women. Women tend to be the major symbol of how faith is displayed, whether it be the nuns in the Catholic Church, whether it be Muslim women covering. Women seem to bear the brunt of it. Even in France, what we're seeing now with the ridiculous bikini ban. So the fact that Saudi Arabia can be the only Muslim country where women are banned from driving should reflect an anomaly rather than a norm. And yet, what we see in Australia in terms of media, and we can talk about the media forever, is that that seems to be presented as the mainstream image of Islam, but it's not. Then there are things like drinking, which in Islam, the consumption of alcohol is prohibited. And one tends to think that if you come to a Muslim country, you're not allowed to drink. And the Football World Cup that's going to be held in Qatar in 2022, one of the first things, the issues that came up is, will foreigners be allowed to drink? And to the average person, that sounds like they're going to a consumer country, consumer Muslim country, in the sense that they're influenced by Saudi Arabia, largely. And so in Saudi Arabia, we tend to think of all of the extremities. But in Qatar, you can have a drink at a hotel. You can't drink in public, in the same way that you can't drink in public here in Melbourne, in the city of Melbourne. You're not allowed to drink in public. But it is there, and it's allowed. Then there are things like when people go to Dubai, and the same exists in Qatar. If you go to a beach, you're allowed to wear bikinis as a Western woman, and you are. There's no objection to that. So there are those freedoms. If you go to a place like Turkey, none of those are even questioned. So Turkey is very similar to the Western secular model in that respect. And then the application of punishment is also another one that's very controversial. And I think it would be fair to say that even in a conservative country like Qatar, there's not capital punishment that's actually enforced, from what I understand. The locals tell me that if there are those rare cases, then they might send them off to Saudi Arabia for one of the squads out there, unfortunately. But it's very, very rare. But the Middle East, as much as it's shaped by religion, there's a degree of politics around it all, as one can imagine. Firstly, on Arab nationalism. The politics of the Middle East is driven largely in the Arab world by this sense of nationalism, by the sense of Arab unity. This is still something they're longing for. I think the Bishop mentioned earlier, there was a time at the end of the Ottoman Empire when there was a sense of hope that the Arabs would come together as one nation, and then that was never fulfilled. And even today, they still talk about this. And even our imams here in Australia talk about this sense of unity. It's an elusive concept. And I think given the way the world is, that we're breaking up more so than coming together, this sense of unity is probably never going to be there. But one of the reasons why I don't call them the Islamic State, I call them the infidel state, because these people are not Muslims, firstly. It's very clear. One of the principles of Islamic doctrine is that no believer is to kill another believer. And anybody who has an objection to an article that's in the Quran is deemed a non-believer by the scholars. So if these people are going out and killing believers, I ask you, are they believers? The Quran explicitly says that anybody who kills another believer will go to hell, will not taste paradise. Will not taste paradise. And we know that all Muslims will go to paradise if you believe the doctrine. So it's absolutely clear. The reason I mention that concept of unity is one of the appeals to those who don't understand the faith of the infidel state is the notion of a caliphate and the sense of unity. So that's an attraction for some of those who actually have no understanding of the faith. The caliphate is definitely there in terms of when God refers to the caliphate, he refers to Adam, for example, as the first caliph, as the leader of all creation. When he asks Iblis, Satan's about to him, and Iblis demonstrates his arrogance and says, I will not bow to you. But the caliphate represents the leadership of humanity. In the interest of time, let me cut to some of the main things. The Arab Spring, let me talk a little bit about that, because I think that shaped some of the discussion as to where things are and why things are the way they are. I was in Qatar at the time that the Arab Spring erupted in December 2010 in Tunisia with the person who set himself aligned there. And what was very clear was how quickly it spread and the fear that it presented for some of the governments that were there at the time. So when it swept from Tunisia across to Algeria, and then there was a little bit in Jordan from memory, there was some protests in Oman, and then across to Egypt. And then there were protests in Bahrain, and it got to Syria. When Bahrain started becoming a little bit volatile, up to Bahrain, until things happened in Bahrain and Syria, the monarchies in the Middle East, and we know that there are issues with the monarchies, were all supportive of this Arab Spring. And then they saw that politically, their own monarchies were potentially at risk. They stopped supporting the Syrians and their determination to get rid of their leadership. So there was a political will there. But the Arab Spring actually faltered when it came to Syria, in my opinion. And we're still seeing the results of that. What we saw in Syria was initial support from the West and from many other countries that dissipated very, very quickly, unfortunately, for reasons that those close to Syria would probably know better than I. But having seen it, and seen the dynamic change within the media within a week, when the monarchies realised that their own establishments were at stake, they decided that enough was enough, and they put an end to the protests that were in Bahrain, and they stopped supporting those who were part of the uprising in Syria. So the fact that the Free Syrian Army is supported still by the likes of Saudi today, to a lesser extent, is a reflection of the fact that that's how they started, but that the support has withered away. But in the Arab world and in the Middle East, there's still this yearning for a change in the leadership, for a change in the political landscape, for a voice. That's not there. So this is what they were really looking for, more than anything. By removing their leaders of the day, they were hoping that they would have more of a voice. And things haven't quite panned out that way, unfortunately. And it might be some time before they do. Some of the more prevalent attitudes that still exist today in this part of the world is that the others are out to get us, and who the others are is quite a mystery, but America seems to be a common enemy for most in that whole region, whether it be Turks, whether it be Egyptians, whether it be Arabs, whether it be other countries. Even the Kurds, it would be fair to say, are supported from time to time depending on the position of those who wish to benefit from their presence there. So there's a very strong sense that they're out to get us, that they don't want us, they don't want to stay in the Middle East, that they don't want us to be united, and that there's a prevalent bias against Palestine. And we know the Palestinian and Israeli issue is really one that would take days and weeks to even try to get one's head around, so I'm not going to go into that. But in terms of migration, where all this leads to is that these rich countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia ultimately take in these refugees. And the sense of opulence that exists in some of these rich countries, and the fact that some can have it all while others have very little. So those who come from even Lebanon, we saw a lot of males that have come from Lebanon to work in the Gulf. And in fact, Bishop, you may know better than myself, the number of women, they say, in Lebanon far outnumbers the number of men, because most of the men have gone offshore. This was until the Syrians came in. So there is a sense of injustice, even when they do migrate to a richer Arab country. And I think it's fair to say that there's a sense of those who are trying to flee any of these wars are looking for safe havens initially within the Gulf states, whether it be the UAE, whether it be Qatar, Saudi Arabia, where at least the language is familiar to them if they don't speak English. So from that perspective, they're looking for a new start, but what they face is often a sense of discrimination and false hopes. They're able to get by, but when they see the opulence that the royal families in these countries live with, then there's a bit of, they realise that there is disparity there. And at the same time, there's a great sense in the Muslim world that these Arab leaders who are monarchs are trying to do things that are far beyond what the Islamic teachings state. One of those examples you can see in Mecca, which has become a high-rise city around the holy site around the Kaaba, whereby when we go there as a pilgrim, you see that there's all of these massive buildings, 50, 80-storey tall buildings now, and the Kaaba itself, which is only about 3 stories high, has been dwarfed. So that sense of losing the faith within the custodians of the holy cities is there for everybody to see as well. So the net migration and the impacts of that, what we're seeing at the moment, in my opinion, is that the Lebanese are looking to migrate out for a better life. There's been, the war there has, from the 1970s, is still, and the sense of instability, the murder of the Prime Minister Hariri not so long ago, has still left Lebanese people feeling that if there's an opportunity to leave, they'd leave. Sudan went through a war, Syria's gone through a war, Iraq's gone through a war, Egypt has gone through instability. There is still a deep sense that if there's an opportunity to leave, that people will leave. And nobody wants to leave their home, but there is still this desperation to leave. And what we're seeing in the Mediterranean, that we'll see increasingly over the next months, will again be a reflection of the fact that the North African communities will all still want to leave for economic reasons. There's a deep sense that most of the people that I saw are still suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of being involved in some sort of, as a minimum, political upheaval. I think what we've seen in Turkey in the last month has left the Turks of either persuasion deeply scarred, irrespective of which side you're on. And so there's a sense that of trauma in these people that we need to be very cognizant of when we take them in Australia or when we see them out there. Finally, just the impact of that conflict. When you're in the Middle East and you see something like even Al Jazeera English and the war all around you, it does have an impact on your psyche. It does create a sense of injustice, unfairness, and it does create, that leads to political vacuums being created as well, and an opportunity for those who are of the infidel state and some of their likes to capitalise on that, unfortunately. But most importantly, I think that as a developed and rich country, the most important thing that we have to uphold is the sense that democracy is there for everybody. We can't meddle in the stability of these countries. What we're seeing is that many of these countries feel that they've been meddled with, that outside influences have come in and have disrupted their country, whether it be Iraq, whether it be Syria, whether it be Turkey very recently. We need to be consistent in our support for democratic governments firstly, because that's what these people aspire to. Let me finish by saying that we all have a duty to play in creating stable governments, because I think that is one of the things that will lead to a stabilisation in migration, at least. That there will always be people who want to move, but if we can stem the flow, the outflow from these countries, one of the ways we're going to do it is by creating stable countries that are economically prosperous, and they will prosper if they're stable for long enough. Diversity is a difficult place to be, and I think the more we can get these countries to embrace diversity, where for hundreds of years these countries lived, and these people with different faiths, with different ethnicities, lived together, why all of a sudden have they fallen apart? And some of it has to do with that, with the loss of tolerance for diversity. So diversity is extremely difficult to create. It's even harder, I believe, to maintain. But I think that's what keeps us together as a nation here in Australia, and that's what I'd like to think will keep those countries together when they begin to embrace that a little bit more. Thank you for listening to me today.
Thank you, Mr. Pedro. Our final speaker this evening is Father Fabio Baggio. Father Fabio is a missionary of the Scalabrinian congregation, the missionaries of San Charles Borromeo. He was born in Bassano del Grappa in Italy. He was councillor of the Episcopal Commission for Migrations of Chile in Santiago de Chile from 1995 to 1997, and was director of the Migration Department of the Archdiocese of Buenos Aires in Argentina from 1997 to 2002. Father Fabio worked as a researcher in the Center for Latin American Migration Studies in Buenos Aires from 1998 to 2002. He taught as extraordinary professor at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the Universidad del Salvador in Buenos Aires from 1999 to 2002, and at the Institute of Theology of Sao Paulo in Brazil. He was director of the Scalabrini Migrant Center in Quezon City in the Philippines from 2002 to 2010. And at the same time, he was editor of the Asian Pacific Migration Journal and also Asian Migration News. He was vice president of the Philippines Migrant Rights Watch from 2003 to 2010, and he was coordinator of the Migration Theology program at the Loyola School of Theology in Quezon City from 2008 to 2010. Father Fabio is currently director of the Scalabrini International Migration Institute in Rome. He is presenting on the European perspective of the migration crisis currently facing Europe as a result of these conflicts in the Middle East. Please welcome Father Fabio Baggio.
Good evening to everyone, and thanks again to the organizer for inviting me again to this colloquium. I took the liberty to the title to my contribution different from what was sent to me in the invitation, just because I think it is the main content that I want to present tonight. Conflict-driven migration to Europe, when humanistic principles are at stake. Before I start my presentation, allow me to have some methodological clarifications. I will start to present a critical reflection on the current refugee crisis in Europe. We call it refugee crisis. It is called in many other ways. It's also called like humanitarian crisis today, or identity crisis of Europe, depending on the different perspectives which are presented by different scholars. It is referring to an phenomenon we called mixed flows, because there are new migration flows composed by economic migrants, and I will put them in between quotation marks, and forced migrants. They are very difficult definition categories to be defined for migrants, looking at the root causes of their migration. But in my presentation, would like to focus on forced migrants fleeing from conflicts, and especially conflicts in the Middle East. I would like also to focus on the, geographically speaking, on the 28 members of the European Union, not talking about all Europe, but just the European Union. And as for the time frame, I will just refer to the last 4 years, considering specifically the impact of the civil war in Syria, which started in 2012. Well, a brief outline of my contribution, 4 points. The first point is that some figures on the conflict-driven migration to Europe, some different approaches or reactions to the phenomenon, an urgent call to restate humanistic principle, and some conclusive remarks. I will make use of a PowerPoint just because I will present some figures. It is good to have them just on the screen. According to the 2015 UNHCR report, we can have some good figures, general figures of forced displacement. UNHCR is presenting a figure of 65.3 million forcibly displaced people worldwide, with a more than 50% increase from 2011, where the displaced people were counted as 42.5 million. Out of them, of this big number, 21.3 million are refugees, with a 55% increase in 4 years. 3.2 million are asylum seekers, 40.8 million are internally displaced persons. From 2011 to 2015, around 30 million people were compelled to leave their country, and they are displaced. According to the UNHCR figure, you can see the map, only 15 conflicts generated such an amount of displaced people. In 2015, 12.4 million people were newly displaced due to conflict or persecution. By the end of 2015, 11.7 million Syrians were counted as displaced either within Syria or abroad. More than 54% of all refugees worldwide are coming from 3 countries: Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. And this is another map provided by UNHCR. There are 2 main entry points to Europe, corresponding to what we call the Eastern and Central Mediterranean routes. According to the official statistics, the arrivals by sea in the last 4 years were counted as follows. In 2012, there were over 22,000 arrivals. In 2013, more than 59,000 arrivals. In 2014, 260,000 arrivals. In 2015, more than 1 million arrivals. And again, according to the UNHCR, this map is part of the website which is fully dedicated to the last stats about refugees in Europe. You can see the great amount of people which who arrived actually in Europe, more than 1 million, according to the two main routes which are designed by the harrods that you can see, the central and the eastern Mediterranean routes. And there is already one figure for the 2016, the first 6 months, 211,000 arrivals already in these months. As for the asylum application in the European Union, in the last 4 years, you can see a notable increase from the 332,000 in 2012 up to the 1.3 million application in 2015. And the Eurostat are also providing a graphic just to see how this kind of application has been increasing in the last 10 years. The blue line is just saying the new applications just in the years from 2014 to 2015. Actually, the country receiving the application, the top 5 countries of application are Germany, Hungary, Sweden, Austria, and Italy. And you can see also the variation in the 2 years, the last 2 years, 2014 and 2015. You can see how Germany is actually receiving a lot of refugees, also according to the policy which has been implemented in the last months. I say approaches in my outline, I would say reactions now. What have been the reactions from the European Union and the members of the European Union? Actually, there is a huge difference between what are the official statements of the European Commission and what are the national statements. What have been the discussion in different countries and eventually the decision taken in the single countries. As for the European Commission, in the 2015 a new agenda on migration was presented. I quote from the agenda: there were 4 pillars, and the 3rd pillar recites strengthening the common asylum policy with increases in the flows of asylum seekers. The EU's asylum policies need to be based on solidarity towards those needing international protection, as well as among the EU member states, whose full application of the common rules must be ensured through systematic monitoring. In a statement, in a speech for the State of the Union in 2015, the EC President Jean-Claude Juncker states, across Europe, we now have common standards for the way we receive asylum seekers, in respect of their dignity, for the way we process their asylum applications, and we have common criteria which our independent justice systems use to determine whether someone is entitled to international protection. But these standards need to be implemented and respected in practice. And this is clearly not yet the case. We can see this every day on television. On the other side, we have a different national stance and declarations. Germany has adopted an open-door policy. In September 2015, Chancellor Angela Merkel committed to take in 800,000 refugees, abandoning the Dublin regulation. Italy, on the other side, has always adopted an open-door policy during the last years. In October 2014, Prime Minister Matteo Renzi said the Dublin Agreement is dead. It isn't technically, but it is politically. On the other side, Austria, Hungary, and the Netherlands closed their borders. I would like to quote the words of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, we cannot let Brussels put itself above the law. We won't let them push their bitter fruits of the EU cosmopolitan immigration policy. We will not import crime, terrorism, homophobia, and a brand of anti-Semitism that sets synagogues ablaze. On the other side, Macedonia, Serbia, and Croatia, and Slovenia limited entry to migrants who could provide they were from Syria, Iraq, or Afghanistan. Sweden also tightened its border, limiting the inflow to few migrants with identity papers and issuing only temporary residence permits to new arrivals. And looking at the facts, even if the EC statements are so generous, we have a strong move by the EU to stop asylum seekers' inflows with the assistance of transit countries. It is a case of Turkey. In March of 2016, the highly criticized deal between the EU and Turkey actually allowed Greece to return to Turkey all new irregular migrants arriving to the territory. There is an urgent call to restate humanistic principle. And when I refer to humanistic principle, I'm not referring only to those who are coming to a specific period of time, which was called humanism, but I'm referring to those who are part of a treasure of every civilization, a part of a treasure of many religions and philosophical thoughts. And they are part of a wealth of humankind. Ban Ki-moon stated just a few months ago, we are facing the biggest refugee and displacement crisis of our time. Above all, this is not just a crisis of numbers, it is also a crisis of solidarity. In one of the official statements by the European Union, there was a clear reference to the humanistic principle during the assistance to be given to refugees during this time. And there were 4 humanistic principles which were highlighted. The first is humanity. Human suffering must be addressed wherever it is found, with particular attention to the most vulnerable. Neutrality. Humanitarian aid must not favor any side in an armed conflict or other dispute. Impartiality. Humanitarian aid must be provided solely on the basis of need without discrimination. Independence. The autonomy of a humanitarian objective from political, economic, military, or other objectives. Well, if these are the principles we can state looking at the deal with Turkey, if they are actually kept and they are grounded in all the discussion which is undergoing during this time. But I think these 4 principles are not enough. And we have other principles which should be added. The first is the principle of the centrality of the human person, which is also shared by many civilizations around the world, society, nation states, and religions. Beyond every economic or political interest, the human person is the center of every political discussion. The centrality should be translated into concrete engagement in upholding human rights, dignity, and development. The second is solidarity. Ban Ki-moon referred directly to it. It is a solidarity which should be beyond borders. It cannot be understood only nationwide. It's resulting from belonging to the one human family. It is a real ground for the principle of fraternity and sorority, which, together with freedom and equality, is a legacy from the European Enlightenment. And the third one is global justice, which is actually the moral duty to share resources with those who have a limited access to the world's wealth. As I said before, all these three principles, and we may be willing to have more, are fully shared majority of humankind. I would like just to conclude my presentation with three conclusive remarks. The first is like a due tribute to those who died during their experience of migration, trying to reach the promised land on the other side. The death toll in the Mediterranean Sea is claiming at least 14,000 from 2012 to 2015. 14,000 deaths. This is a mixed sign of despair and hope, and should be also understood in this way, as people are just trying to reach what they cannot reach where they are, and to get what we cannot obtain where they are. What has been called upon by Pope Francis, just looking at the death in the Mediterranean Sea, is a threat which is coming, a threat of a globalization of indifference. That being used, at least in Europe, to see a lot of scenes, a lot of pictures, to listen to a lot of stories, and we are getting indifferent to what is happening. There is a missing reflection in all this story, and I think is a reflection on responsibilities. Who is or who are the responsible of what is happening? And I'm not just referring to the human traffickers. I'm not just referring to those who are facilitating one way or the other the exodus of the people and the migration of people. I'm referring to the root causes of migration, to what is compelling people to leave their country. This is why we stated in the real beginning that even the definition of economic migrant should be revised. Because misery, poverty is part of a deal in many of the countries we just quoted. Conflict, persecution, and religious persecution is part of the deal in many of the countries of origin of refugees and migrants. Whose responsibilities? If we look at the historical picture, we should think about the former colonies and the colonizers, and all the responsibility which have been there for this actual situation in African and Asian very special way. They are not just historical responsibility, they are actual responsibility. Today we have other kind of colonialism undergoing. It is economic colonialism. And we know about what are the interests are actually maintaining, keeping a situation of conflict in many other regions. Who is selling the weapons? What's the business? Where are the real interests and the geopolitical interests to keep turmoils all around in order to make other kind of business? And we can go on with this, but it's a very long discussion. Beside everything, I do believe that there is a way to solve the situation, and I call it global stewardship as one of the principles. It is also shared by many civilizations, cultures, and religions. Global stewardship is calling upon the whole humankind to take responsibility of governing this world. Not just the country that I belong to. It's not a question of nationality. It's a question of a unique human family taking care of the world which was given to them just to administer, just to govern, just to keep it alive. And wherever there are situations of turmoil, there are situations of conflict, and difficulties and misery and poverty, there is a responsibility we have to share with the people staying in that place. Global stewardship is what is compelling an international response to what is happening, and not the selfish responses which we assisted to the last time by many of the European nations. It's not just a question of Europe, it's a question of the world. And we share many of the concern with many other countries, and we are sure, at least as Christians and Catholic, that the claim and the calls of Francis is doing to a globalization of solidarity is the only way to solve the problem. Thank you.
So we're just going to put the lapel microphones on each of our speakers, and we have 20 minutes for questions before we wrap up for the evening. So we have 2 roving microphones for people. We're just going to take those around. So if you've got a question, please raise your hand, and it'd be great if you could say your name and where you're from and who you're directing your question to, whether it's an individual or whether it's to the panel. And please keep your questions concise and your comments concise so that we can wrap this up and get you all out by 9. So if anyone has any questions, we can start.
I'm Father Savino, Carabinian, various Muslim St. Richard's, of Fitzroy. I would like to ask Mr. Byron, on the last principle of stewardship, global stewardship, how much do we, or how would you comment on the many acts of terrorism happening in the world these days, and therefore how loud is the voice of the Muslim leaders against it?
I can only answer from the perspective of Europe, of course, where I'm living now. And what happened over the last blast and tragedies which affected Europe was a huge movement of Muslim leaders in taking not only distance but accusing, denouncing what was happening as not part of religion. And I think it is not the first. Actually, we have been also assisting to such movements before. But this time it was part of a general movement, at least in Europe. Having on Sunday many of these leaders attending Mass, stay in the church as a clear sign of not only solidarity, but a joint movement against any kind of violence and terrorism was a very good way to signify what is the solidarity and the engagement they can have. Something more can be done, I think, yes. Something more on all parts can be done. On the Catholic part, on the Christian part, and on the Muslim part can be done. But I think dialogues are there, and many good things can happen. Good things can happen in the future.
From my perspective, I think the voices are probably never going to be loud enough. Every week, in every mosque, there is mention of the fact that what we're seeing that's purportedly done in the name of my faith is not anywhere near the teachings of my faith. So our problem is not in those who are affiliated with the faith, but those who claim to be part of the faith, but in reality are not. In terms of the message that Muslim leaders need to get out there, it would be fair to say we're probably not doing a good enough job of that. Whether it be locally, internationally. part of it is that if you're a moderate, the chances of being heard in the mainstream media are fairly remote, irrespective of what topic you're talking about. If you present an extreme view to the media, you're probably more likely to get attention. So there is that challenge. It's not to say that that's a reason why we should not do it. But the voice of the Muslims do need to come out more often. I think we will see more of that. There are examples coming out more and more each day. The fact that we had a priest in France who was murdered brutally very recently, and virtually every Muslim leader around the world came out and denounced that and stood in solidarity with the Catholic community, is an indication that Muslim leaders understand the problem and that they're getting braver in speaking out about the fact that there are people who are trying to hijack the religion for means other than their faith. But we're not home. We need to improve, we need to get better at it, and we need to find ways of reaching out to people in a clearer message. That's definitely something that needs to be done.
Yes, so there's a microphone just coming behind you.
My question is to Mr. Akpan. Would you care to say something about who is financially and strategically supporting the infidel state and why?
Well, I wish I knew that question because I'd like to expose them. Look, it's probably not my area of expertise to look at where that financing is coming from. But needless to say, if it was being done legitimately, we'd all know about it. One could probably presume that there are individuals globally who are financing this. What I find most intriguing is that we in the developed world are not strong enough to be able to beat such a small force of, 50, 100,000 people at most. So what is it? Are we afraid of collateral damage? Our armies are the biggest in the world in terms of the American army, the Australian army, the Turkish army, and yet we don't seem to be able to obliterate these people. So more so than the financing of those people, there's probably a large amount of oil smuggling that I'm advised is happening. And who allows that to occur? Who shares borders with these people? That's probably one place to start looking. But we can look at who supports them, but why can't we, as the 99% of the rest of the world, overcome that? Why can't we overcome them is probably the question that we need to be asking our own respective governments around the world. Why aren't we doing more to stop what's happening out there? So I don't know the answer to financially who's supporting them, but I think there's a lot more that we should be doing to actually prevent the problem from getting any worse. So I'm happy to take answers where people do know.
So just a reminder, please, if you could say your name and perhaps where you're from and who you're addressing to. We've got Bishop Rabbat, Bishop Pepe, and Father Fabio. Yes, you're next, Mark.
I'm Mark Clark from the Catholic Social Justice Office. Just a question for all the panel. Just picking up Father Fabio's point about the globalisation of solidarity. I was just wondering if you comment on what's becoming increasingly the opposite in Australia, where Australia is now being used as the model of how to stop the boats. And where are we as a nation going in terms of this globalisation when we promised to take 12,000 Syrians and so far only 200 have arrived? So a question for each of the panel.
I believe the problem is that we often are looking towards other people. We seldom ask the questions, do we want to solve this issue? And it's easy at the end of the day to say, let others do whatever they wish. At the moment they come into our backyard, it becomes a problem. And we know well that we only vote for people in power, not because of ethics. It's because how much taxes or whatever they will reduce or how much money they will bring back to us. And we know while welcoming refugees or this globalization idea of solidarity with other people who are on the average poorer than we are becomes a challenge because, as Jesus Christ said, love thy neighbor and thyself. And suddenly I can no longer have 3 jackets, I have to maybe sacrifice one. And we live in a world where sacrifice is only for aliens, not for us. So unless we change our lexicon, mainly in school, but also I think within the media, within the public square, where we no longer ask the question, am I my brother keeper? Rather, we say, I am my brother keeper. As long as we keep on asking this question, then we're saying it's either for God to solve the problem or someone else, but it is not my problem. And don't dare bring someone who does not talk my talk and walk my walk. Don't dare ask me to pay a little bit more, because you have to do the sacrifice, but not me.
Mr. Deputy, did you want to comment?
I think we've all been disappointed by the lack of numbers that have come out here. There was a lot of fanfare around the 12,000, and I think we expected that to happen fairly rapidly. The immigration minister has cited security as one of his main concerns. I'm not sure how he's going to overcome that in the near term. It's something we need to keep talking to him about. Whether we see another commitment made like that remains to be seen. But clearly there needs to be a better way to bring those people who are in dire straits over there, some of them out here legitimately, who will actually make a serious contribution. As we know, this country has seen from migration for 200 years. So there's more work to be done there, I think, with speaking to federal governments on that point as to why they're not coming in, what are the real barriers. So time will tell.
Well, I'm not surprised. As I showed in my presentation, I think Australia will be just in line with most of the countries who can eventually assist migrants around worldwide or around the world. And just another figure which can be shared, 87% of the 20 million refugees are actually in developing countries, not in developed countries. Just is leaving only 13% in the developed countries, which is also telling how generosity or solidarity is actually shared now in the countries. But I'd like to raise only 3 points. You can have 3 different stands. The first one is a very secular and selfish stand. We are just a nation, we think about our interests, and what is convenient to us will be accepted, which is what is not convenient will be rejected. If refugees are not convenient, reject them. If they are dangerous to such kind of welfare, which has been a real achievement for a country, they will be treated as a possible threat to what citizens should avail of. On the second stand is about solidarity, and I think is something we share with many, as I said before, religion, and with other many civilization and cultures. And I think has been somehow forgotten and lost also in the education. And just looking at the world, we are becoming more and more selfish in our way of living, and living like we are the only one in the world. And this is some kind of failure which is coming with that, maybe what we call our generation, which is now looking at only ourselves. I think it can be restated and recalled, and can be reintroduced also in education with a lot of experiences can be done. On the third, which is more than solidarity, and I put there, is what about justice. And this is another understanding, where I understand the common good not as a national common good, but the common good of the whole humankind. If you refer to such common good, what we call the distributed justice should be executed. And in this way, if people would not have access to the wealth and the resources, we should be responsible, we, those who have resources, to make them have that access to resources, which would change immediately all the picture, where the responsibility is not only to welcome them, but also to give them this access even before they ask it for. This is.
Yes, George.
I'm not a theologian, I'm an architect, and I first worked in the Middle East in Basra, where we built a hospital. What puzzles me is I'm being persuaded by many people that we're different. And when I work in the Middle East and elsewhere, I find that we are substantially similar. My question to you three is, why don't we emphasize the Abrahamic origins that you share? The implication is you're very different. With respect, your faiths and your expression are not. I think if we built a shrine to Abraham, we might get people from different faiths. Seriously. That's all.
Theologians.
An architect will think as an architect. But I'm sure once we build one, there will be a group who will claim that this is our father and not your father. Once again, it goes back to how we foresee the world. As long as we're living in paradise, there is no problem. It's once we are challenged. And I personally do not like to look at it that it's my generation because it makes me older than the younger generation or whatever. But we know well, for whatever reason, our generation was brought up with the idea that, look, sacrifice is important. Nowadays we live with the word of, God bless his soul, Steve Jobs. It's the word of the I. We like it or not. It's true Descartes started that. But nowadays is iPhone, I exit, I make, I do everything, and who cares if you do it or not. That's the way we're treating our kids, our children, even at work. We don't have a time to weep. We don't have a time to sit down and cherish who we are. We don't have the time. You have white hair, it's your problem, you're fired. We need a younger person. We live in a world of Pokemon Go. In this world, no one has the time. I'm sure we all speak about it and maybe, migrants or stranger to this land in America, things like that, keep on saying, we've been in this place for 20 years. We don't know who is our neighbor. So how are you going to talk to someone from the Middle East if here in Australia you don't know who is your neighbor? While if you go to the Middle East, you said we don't look different, people remain where their ancestors have been for hundreds of years. So it takes really, I believe, an effort and a commitment of really digesting your faith. I think, as we've heard, the speaker saying, sadly, it is what we know of. I always like to bring this issue of the apple. Keep on asking young Catholics, young Orthodox, what did Eve offer Adam? And you will get 99% of the time the same answer. She gave him an apple.
or there is no apple, sadly. But how can you beat what you see? It was painted as an apple, then it should be an apple. And people don't go back. And at the same time, I go back to the fact, are you willing, or the person next to you or whomever, to pay tomorrow $10 for a liter of gas? Because if tomorrow you have a premier or a prime minister or whomever who say, look, we're going to be brothers. We're going to respect Qatar and, Angola and all this, oil-producing companies. We're going to be fair. Well, we're going to pay them what we owe them. And then suddenly you're going to pay $10 for your petrol. I doubt if this Prime Minister will survive more than one day. So we need to rethink, I believe, the way we look at the world and whether the person next to me is truly my brother. And he deserves an opportunity. And I'm not calling for communism or socialism. I believe that we owe it, especially in nations like Australia and in America, we owe it to the rest of the world of giving them an opportunity and the hope that they can grab it and fly with it. Thank you.
If I may just say, I'm glad you're an architect who's brought up this question, because one of the things we've got going for us is the Muslims' holidays, Friday, the Jews are Saturday, and the Christians are Sunday. And so there's an opportunity, I think, it's a serious one, to build venues that we can share. Not maybe a shrine, but a facility where we can all worship God. I think there's an opportunity to do that. And the real opportunity here is that the migrants who are coming out, who have been coming out in the last 10 years, are settling into the areas of Melbourne that are more impoverished, where there is a larger degree of social disadvantage, it would be fair to say. And if we don't handle it carefully, we're going to see polarisation in those outer suburbs of Melbourne. And I think there's a real opportunity to build joint facilities in those areas as a demonstration of what a harmonious society we are. And a commitment from the faith leaders towards something like that. It was experimented with in Meadow Heights. The Meadow Heights Mosque is built right beside a church, and the planning for that happened in tandem. Opportunities like that, we should seriously explore those. We know that we are stretched insofar as infrastructure as a result of the population boom that we're seeing in Melbourne, and that there is a serious opportunity. It doesn't have to be anything monumental, but something that acknowledges the fact that we are.
Be interested, we actually have that thrust on us in a hospital where there was a multi-faith space from another generation that had a lot of religious elements in it. So we had to create the space in a way that was acceptable to all. And we ended up effectively getting rid of everything except fire and water. And there was great unity about this very contemplative pond. There was unity about fire. So I'd suggest to your space, start with those without burning anything down and keeping the CFA happy. And from there, I think...
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately we do need to end our question and answer time now. So thank you all for your contributions. For those of you who can stay, I'm sure our panelists will be able to perhaps stick around for a few minutes. And I won't take up any more time with any closing remarks, but I do just want to say this: in this digital age where we have to get a message across in 144 characters, the other day I saw a tweet that said, "Today marks the start of Migrant and Refugee Week, 22nd to 28th of August, #asylum seeker." And somebody very quickly tweeted, "Today marks the start of Human Being and Human Being Week, 22nd to 28th of August, #human being." I think that captured it very well. Could you please thank our panelists?
to say thank you. Before I say thank you to our guest speakers tonight, I wish sincerely to say thank you to each and every one of you for being here tonight. Yes, it is true. I like that Tiona. We mark the beginning of Migrant and Refugee Week. The effort is that of bringing this, and this is the effort of this dialogue, of this colloquium, to know that behind numbers and statistics and votes, we have human beings, and this is what we need to be reminded. So thank you so very much. I quite forgot, but I want just to acknowledge also that we have young students from a school. I just cannot see what school, but I think you come from Bendigo. Do you? Oh, no, okay, that's all right. So thank you very much. Again, it's also an exercise in education, so thank you very much. In saying thank you, I wish to begin by thanking Bishop Rabbat, because I know we had to negotiate in between commitments. So your presence here, Bishop Rabbat, is not taken for granted. Thank you very much. But thank you very much for reminding us that in all of human beings there are no minorities. We belong, and we belong very much. So thank you very much. But also personally, every time I have a chance to converse with Bishop Rabbat, both individually in the living room of his house in Sydney, or when I hear him talking, it reminds me of the old prophets. There is always some wisdom coming from there. So thank you very much for wishing that to talk, and you may keep it in your living room, so whatever it is, to remind you of your presence here tonight. Thank you so very much. Mr. Kipi, I was a bit anxious in introducing you, because I had quite the understanding that you were a Muslim walking into a Christian world in a moment in which things are in a debate. So I wasn't sure, actually. I was not comfortable to introduce you as a moderate Christian, a moderate Muslim, because I asked myself, if there is a moderate Muslim, it means that there are extremists. And I wanted to avoid that. And I was asking myself whether we have moderate Christians. Would that be appropriate to call somebody a moderate Christian or an extremist? But then, as you were talking, you reminded me of a statement by Cardinal Turan in one recently at the meeting of the Interreligious Dialogue. And he said something to everybody. In introducing his talk, he said that whatever we say may be quickly forgotten. Whatever we do, stay there. The fact that you got very personally moved by sharing with us the example of your Filipino house helpers, stay with us. Thank you very much. I'll explain you after what that is. Father Fabio, we appreciate the efforts of coming all the way from the holy city of Rome. So in this whole discussion, I think you brought us to seriously consider, which is something that we need to do strongly in Australia, and Mark wanted us to go through that, and it is an open reflection, that unless we enter into a dialogue of solidarity, and the dialogue of solidarity is the only way to move from looking at migrant refugees, asylum seekers as liabilities. Solidarity is what will help us into dialogue with all the situation, the country and the regions, in finding solutions that are based on humanistic principles and not of self-interest. So thank you very much, Fabio. I wish to say thank you to Fiona and the same thank you. I think she's on the eve of an international somewhere. Okay. What I want to say is that Fiona offers her photography and writing services to religious and non-profit organizations across Australia, and I'm sure she'd be happy to work with any of you here. She has a website, very easy to remember, www.fionabasile.com, or perhaps you may have a word with her afterwards. So as we thought to say thank you to you, we thought that some flowers would have been quite appropriate.
Thanks,
Once again, thank you to everyone. May I also say a very special thank you to Dr. Ballard for he's the key to open really the ACU, and this is the 6 years, and thank you so very much. And thank you also to George, Lucia, and Luis, and Fides. We work together at the Australian Catholic Migrant and Refugee Office, and we hope that this has been an exercise that somehow we can take home and reflect upon. Thank you very much indeed.